Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations number 32. And we got in the building, one of the go-to original down south boys himself, Dr. Maurice Hobson, assistant professor of African American Studies and History at Georgia State University. What's going on, good sir? How are you?
And I'm slow motion, so just trying to hold it all in the road and finish up this book and do everything else I'm supposed to do, sit on dissertation committees, master's thesis, and all that stuff. So
you basically taking over the world one thesis committee at a time, then. Okay.
I can't even say that. I'm just trying to hold it in the road.
Oh, good. Well, you know what you got to do to get into the club. How did you become outcasted?
During that year, 1994, particularly spring 1994, my parents divorced. One of the ways in which I coped with a lot of those things was I would put Outkast cassette tape or the CD in my Walkman or my Discman, and I would play this music as rebel music. It was really more rebel music, and the fact that there was a black righteous component to it, and there were, the Southern dialect, but that black righteous component to it was rebel music, in my opinion. And so, in my own way of kind of rebelling against everything going on, I used to just kind of really find myself in my own little outcasted world where I memorized everything. So when I was a senior in high school, Outkast came to my hometown. I grew up in Selma, Alabama, and so every year they have the Bridge Crossing Jubilee. And Outkast came to my hometown, did a free concert. I have pictures of it and whatever, whatnot. I got a chance to meet him and whatever, whatnot. And at the time, Andre was kind of starting to go through that transition to where he began to move a little differently. And, they had a little session after their performance. And one of the things that was particularly interesting is I was interested in just interacting with them, but I wasn't interested in everything else going on. Mm. And they remembered that. So went on to college, played football in college, graduated from college and whatever, whatnot. And by the age of 20, I realized that I wanted to go get a PhD in history and study African Americans and study the American South, because Outkast music had done so much for me in terms of really setting some markers in terms of this is what the South is doing. Mm. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Alabama to do a master's degree in American Studies, African American Studies. And the faculty there, primarily the faculty were white, and they studied the South. They studied a very different South than I did. And there was one African American professor there by the name of Amilcar Shabazz who decided to take me on as a student. And I'm so grateful to Dr. Shabazz for it. And so we had to go to this departmental party once. And he was like, well, Mo, what is it that you really know? What do you enjoy? What do you want to study? And there were two things that I knew very well. I knew football and I knew Outkast. And I didn't want to do anything on football because I was just so tired of football. I was so burned out from it. But that Outkast piece, I mean, by that time there were 3 albums out. First album, Southern Playalistic. Second album, AT Aliens, which came out in '96, right around the Olympics. Third album, Aquemini, 1998. So this is the 4th album. This is fall 2000. Stankonia is out. And I'm like, well, I just really like this whole piece on Southern hip-hop. And so he was like, well, I just think you should consider it. Well, in the process of it, there was a renowned poet, Kalamu Yasalam, that came to the University of Alabama. And we began to talk and whatever, whatnot. He came to do a lecture, and he said, I don't think Outkast is really embodying this Southern piece. I think they're whistling Dixie to kind of get into the game.
Wow.
And I took offense to it, but what he was really doing was challenging me to really critique and like really come up with an argument. So it was a provocative notion to kind of get me to thinking about some things. And so as a result, to take that on, I wrote a master's thesis called What Y'all Really Know About the Dirty South, working towards a black Southern aesthetic and Southern hip hop. This is 2001. Really looking at how the fact that Outkast and Goody Mob had come out of the American South, and because they had such an understanding of the history of race relations, the economics, sociology, the psychology, the politics of it, that the music was very conscious because it is really kind of embodying these conscious ideas about African Americans. And I'll be honest with you, it was based on aesthetic. I cringe when I read it now because it lacks so much depth, but it did provide a space for me. So what happens is, when I got ready to finish my master's degree, Shabazz, who knew that I wanted to go get a PhD in history, he says, listen, Mo, he says, what you wrote was really cool and it was sexy. He says, but it's not going to get you what you need on the next level. Mm. He says, so I'm just letting you know that. And he was being honest with me. And so I went and taught at Tuskegee University for a couple of years, 25-year-old teaching at a historical black college, had a great time doing it and whatnot. And I decided when I was going to go do the PhD that I was going to probably write on private historical black colleges and black power, and how these private schools are havens for children of the black elite to some extent, and then other people come, and how they embody black power. But I went up to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2004, and I took this great professor by the name of Fanon Wilkins. We took a course called Black Politics, Art, and Culture. And as I began to kind of develop this idea that Outkast started talking back to me, the historically black college conversation began to talk back to me. I had taken a course in the fall of 2005 called Race in the City, where we primarily studied northern cities, and I was trying to study New Orleans at the time because of Katrina. And the professors were like, well, you know, the American South is underdeveloped when it comes to this conversation about urban history. And so with all those things kind of came together, I was like, my job is to kind of really collapse all three of these ideas. And I love sports. It's to collapse these ideas of sports, historical black education, historically black colleges, Outkast, and these urban and rural conversations. And it just put me in Atlanta. And so from that, I wrote a dissertation called The Dawning of the Black New South. And we get into real conversations around Atlanta, the Olympics, and how the city was franchised for the world, but how the franchising of the city demonized, criminalized, and disfranchised poor people. And one of the counter narratives that we can understand through it is looking at Outkast early music, because it actually serves as a real counter narrative in calling, it looks at it critiques the social cost of what it means for Atlanta to franchise for the world, but what it's actually doing on the ground for poor working class, homeless people, and who just so happen to be black. This idea of a black Mecca is particularly interesting because Atlanta has the highest poverty rates of any major city. It has the highest homeless rate of any major city, and people just so happen to be African American. So I look at how this thing happens.
One of the things, though, I think as you were talking, so many things started popping off in my head, especially this idea of, you know, it seems like a generational thing, because I know when you were talking about how you said that they were whistling Dixie, that there's always been a tension that's not really discussed, but is still a major component of how we understand Southernness after the Civil Rights Movement, that there's a lack of, I guess, agency that is articulated in a way that was previously understood and engaged, you know what I'm saying, the music-wise, you know, gospel. I was thinking about the connection between gospel and hip-hop, especially in the South. But I want to get back to this idea about the literal space of the South in the post-civil rights era, because that's one of the things I'm just really fascinated with and getting perspective on is oftentimes when we think about the South, we don't necessarily think about it as an urban space. You know what I'm saying? So when we think about Atlanta, even, you know, when Cast first got put on in the early 90s, Atlanta was not considered to be a major urban hub. That didn't start till like 96 with the Olympics or whatever.
Right.
But you know, what are some of your additional thoughts on the ways that the literal idea of space is used not only in Outkast music, but in how we start to really renegotiate what Southernness means in the American South during this time period?
Look, that's a great question, and it really requires us to really grapple with a couple of different things in terms of discipline. You got to look at demography. You got to look at sociology. You have to look at politics. Politics is going to be a major piece, and I'll discuss that in a minute. And this is one of the things. When I wrote my dissertation, the book is going to be very different than the dissertation, but when I wrote my dissertation, I'm a historian trained in political science, sociology, and economics. So I can crunch numbers on numerous levels in terms of how I come to understand something. Because when you study African American history, sometimes the actual archive data is not available to you. So you have to be able to get after this story in a whole nother capacity. The thing that we should understand, and these are conversations that are ongoing, particularly in the field of history, in the field of Black studies. As you know, those that study African Americans, you must be interdisciplinary because it's necessary to kind of really get after all of these conversations. There are these conversations around the long civil rights movement versus the classical phase. So the long meaning, you know, from the first Africans that came here to the present. The classical phase is from Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, to either the Voting Rights Act of 1965 or the assassination of Dr. King, and then there's supposed to be this point of departure to where you have Black Power, which goes from 66 to 75, these nice little neat compartments, which I don't necessarily agree with. I don't agree with the nice compartments because we see activity going on before this. But what you cannot dispute, and I must promote the state of Alabama when it comes to this, it's because of the Birmingham campaign in 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson calls for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which reestablishes the 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process under the law. Mm-hmm. So this is 1964. Coming out of my hometown of Selma, Alabama, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which puts federal poll watchers in so that everyone has the right to really exercise that right to vote. So it's no more that good old boy Southern politics and whatnot. What we can't dispute is that Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act politically changed the American South because we see African Americans that are able to voice opinions based on voting. And we see a major upswing of Black elected officials, both urban and rural, between 1965 and 1975. And what happens with this is the best place to kind of see how this parlays in terms of urban spaces is Atlanta, particularly for the American South. And so with that, if you look at the historiography of urban history, usually urban history were these conversations around the Rust Belt, so, you know, Chicago, Detroit, Gary, and how, you know, post-industrial conditioning and all this stuff kind of messed them up, or you saw some things on the West Coast or Northeast. But the new trend and tension was to go back and look at these urban spaces in the American South. So Atlanta provides an interesting space where you can really grapple with this civil rights era conversation, and you can really grapple with this urban history conversation. And what becomes very clear about it is that because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we see an expression of Black political empowerment and electoral politics that parlays itself into the manifestation of Maynard Jackson becoming the mayor of Atlanta. And what happens is Jackson champions the people. He champions for the people. At the time, the city of Atlanta is 54% African American. In 1973, he gets 95% of that vote, and he gets a significant vote of white liberals. So he's put into office. And there are a couple of things that he does that, I mean, like, he really does kind of champion the city. I mean, he expands MARTA. He gives 35% of all city contracts to African Americans, which is part of that conversation around the Black Mecca. He works on crime. He does all these different things, but there are a couple of things that he does in his first 2 terms that make him questionable. The first is firing of the sanitation workers. And that's a loaded conversation, but we don't have time for it. And the second is what's considered to be the mishandling of the Atlanta youth murders, which makes the Black community, particularly working class Black community, look at him differently. So if you think about that, in the Atlanta youth murders supposedly took place between 1979 and 1981. I actually disagree with that, but that's in the book. So we'll, you know, I can't give it all up, but that's in the book. What happens is Outkast and Goody Mob, who comes out of my generation, so we were born mid-70s. Outkast and Goody Mob in '90 have come of age to kind of live through these different things in terms of post-industrial conditioning, in terms of the Atlanta youth murders, in terms of the advent of crack cocaine, in terms of Reaganomics,
Right.
in terms of HIV and AIDS, in terms of the Democratic National Convention, which is a dress rehearsal for the Olympics, in terms of Atlanta winning the Olympics and the calculated steps it took to get the city ready in terms of the building of a 1,000-bed jail on time and under budget, walls on the side of the interstate so the world wouldn't see poverty, creation of the Red Dog Police. You start getting into these real conversations.
But I think it's also important too is that there's a shift in what is considered to be the point of agency, right? Because one of the things that I think about is when we think about the connection between the civil rights movement and Atlanta, you often think about MLK and kind of these idealized, romanticized understanding of civil rights movement.
Right.
But what Outkast and Goody Mob do is they collapse that narrative, especially with the Atlanta child murders. You know what I'm saying? That is like the reference point for me of the shortcomings of the civil rights movement. That instead of looking at the Jim Crow South in terms of this blatant open racism and stuff like that, that often that's what is our point of reference when we think about blacks in the South. They're like, no, we're talking about the Atlanta child murders. I mean, that's like throughout their entire catalog. It's, you know what I'm saying? Like, going to the candy lady, seeing dead kids in the hallway. I think that there's a shift in what the understanding of Southernness and I guess urbanity as it connects to the civil rights movement. It happens with Outkast and Goody Mob, and I think that's really dope.
I don't know, and the reason I say that is it would be improper to make it seem as if they just kind of came to the point where they had this voice.
Right.
Because I mean, when you really interact, when you like look at Mojo and MC Shy-D, and you look at the fact that I feel Wayne Williams was railroaded because he was a talent agent. He was trying to be the next Berry Gordy. So when you start getting into that, you see that narrative. But see, the reason that they're presenting that narrative is what Outkast and Goody Mob are doing is they are really giving you the popular political sentiments of what the hood is talking about. They're really talking about what the streets are saying. And some people will even argue, and I don't know about this in my interaction. I don't know if this, but some people will say that like Cass kind of gets the foot in the door and then Goody Mob is the soul of Atlanta. I mean, I think that they kind of work together in a lot of different ways. But this is the thing. They swept the Atlanta child murders under the rug because as early as the 1970s, Atlanta was already wrapping itself up to get the Olympics. Like that there, and I'll say this to you. There's evidence that the the Atlanta youth murders took place between 1975 and 1985. I'm going to show you something really quickly. Hold on. There is a chapter entitled The Sorrow of a City that looks at the Atlanta child murders. I've written probably the most extensively on the Atlanta youth murders when it comes to this from a historical perspective. These are the FBI papers. All of this. Now, let me put this down. If you knew and understand all of the stuff that's in there, it will blow your mind because it does suggest that the murders took place from 75 to 85, even after Williams was taken into prison. Wow. What's particularly interesting about that is if you go into the neighborhood, everybody's saying the same thing, and they have these particular thoughts, but like no snitching is like not a new phenomenon. So, like this is a reoccurring theme, and so people have particular thoughts about what it is that they're talking about. And so Cass does that, but I mean, they also, conversations around the Confederate battle flag, flying atop the Georgia, there are a lot of conversations. For me, what I do is I really focus on, I'm a political historian by training, and I study the Olympics. I really focus on the first two albums the first album, Outkast and Goody Mob. I'm an Outkast fan. I am probably the biggest Outkast fan to the point where recent concerts, I was there and I'm like, I shouldn't be here because these folk ain't fans like I'm a fan. I mean, like this stuff changed my life. Like I'm serious to the point where I'm like, they really don't even know what they listen to, but it's all good. I wasn't tripping. But when we start talking about this Southern identity, I think what it is doing is it is projecting this conversation around. I don't think Outkast and Goody Mob, particularly Outkast, I don't think that they are really trying to create this Southern dynamic. I think they are being exactly who they are. And it comes across to people saying, well, those boys are from the South. They talk funny, guys. They from the islands and whatever, whatnot. So people have kind of made it be this Southern piece, but I think that they are really giving an account as to what their experience is. And it just so happens to be seen in a Southern light. Mm. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. And I also argue that wherever you see the most resistance, wherever you see the most oppression, particularly the American South, you see the most resistance. Okay. I remember us having that conversation around the Black Panther Party being founded in Lowndes County, Alabama, which is, down the road from where I grew up. And I mean, we see organization, we see agency, we see all these different things. So those that feel that the South lack agency, that's their own insecurity and navel gazing about what they think the American South should be, probably to make them feel better. I'm not sure as to what it could be. But when I moved to Champaign, Illinois, I grew up in a very good home. Parents worked, did everything and whatnot. But people labeled and dismissed me as a backwoods hayseed Southerner because I was from the American South, not because of how I talked, not because of how I looked. They would find out, they'd say, oh, you from the Chi? I'm like, nah. They're like, well, where you from? I'm like, I grew up in Alabama. Oh, aren't you glad you escaped? And I'm sitting up here like, as soon as my degree is conferred, I'm going back. Or who are your parents that you're able to speak standard English? Like, these are questions. And so, and these were African Americans talking to me like this. And so there is this notion that people from the American South are slow on the uptake strictly because you have images that have been created. Mm-hmm. Outkast and Goody Mob took on some of those things, particularly CeeLo in what's the name of the song? Fly Away. He takes that on. I'm from the dirty, filthy, nasty, dirty South. Some of y'all people think we soft. But I swore I'd never write a rhyme like this, but now you're starting to piss me off. Oh, yes, y'all, Sade, he got that silky Southern drawl. Every tooth in my mouth got gold on them all. He kind of breaks down these stereotypes. Dre 3000, well, he was Andre at this point in time in the song Deep. He breaks down this whole conversation. See, I've never been pimped by the system. That's because I ain't no slave. Never tried to sunbathe, never lived off in no cave. Now, he's speaking particular conversation around the Nation of Islam at that point in time. But if you read through that whole piece, he goes up, down, all around. He looks at all of these stereotypes that have been pushed out there. But he also makes a real critique of Atlanta in terms of flying the Confederate battle flag because that's the Georgia state flag. And which they changed to Georgia state flag. The governor changes to Georgia state flag and loses his job because there's a big conversation around the Georgia Dome, which is going to host the Olympics, which flies the state flag, which happens to be the Confederate battle flag, and international governments and black athletes are saying, we're not going to come to the Olympics if you fly that flag, which is the Olympics is going to yield $786 million for the city of Atlanta. So it's a Southern landscape, but it's not just about being Southern. It's Southern. It's about looking at what's going on and talking about what it is that you see.
It's levels to this shit.
You say what?
It's levels to this shit.
It's way levels. I mean, high levels and low levels and no levels at all sometimes.
I ain't mad. Dr. Hobson, we got to get up out of here. So how can the people reach out to you? When can we expect the book that's about to change the game? All that good stuff.
Well, okay. Y'all can hit me up at Georgia State. I don't do a lot of social media. Dr. Bradley will tell y'all we had a real to-do and humdinger trying to get me to get on Google Hangout in terms of how to set it up and whatnot. I'm not on Twitter, but I will be on Twitter soon. Right now I'm just really focusing on writing my book. My book will be out in the fall of 2015. It's entitled The Legend of the Black Mecca, Myth, Maxim, and the Making of Modern Black Atlanta, Georgia. I'll tell you all this. You're going to get a really interesting dose on this conversation around the Black Mecca, Black nationalism, Black internationalism, the calculated steps of Atlanta getting the Olympics, how it cost the people. You're going to get a real critique through Outkast and Goody Mob, but we are going to look at ways in which we understand Atlanta as a Black Mecca. The reason I entitled it The Legend of the Black Mecca is because for all legends, there are some truth. There's some truth to every legend. And so that's the cool thing about it. You can always hit me up, Google me, Maurice Hobson, Georgia State University. You can always kind of get after me that way. I'm probably going to set up some kind of bootleg Twitter account at some point. And I just, it's not being funny. I just, right now the writing is so intense that I have to get to those things. I just have to really work that out. And I got a newborn who kind of controls everything that's kind of going on around me. But that's how you all can get at me. I am on Facebook. You can connect with me through Dr. Bradley. And so we got a couple of different things popping. I'm doing quite a few things with the Smithsonian, and got a couple of different things going on with the NEH in terms of the 50th year of the Voting Rights Act. You can see me around Atlanta doing some particular things. But yeah, that's what I'm doing. So. Right.
No doubt. We appreciate you for dropping bombs and knowledge.
Well, I hope I answered the questions. I hope I provided something that was cool. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I know we've been trying to get up. I might need your help. I got some chapters that are kind of working out, and I need some eyes to see some of this stuff before I send it off to the press, because it's it's a difficult thing to get all this stuff out of your head. And I tell cats all the time, I'm a professor 2 days a week. That's it. Other than that, I'm just Mo Hobson, and Mo Hobson from the spot. So so that's where it is, bro.
It's all good. We appreciate you. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all. Y'all be easy.
All right, peace. Peace is up, 8 times down.